Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we are going to get started with talking about real estate investing. This is lecture one of many. So, today, we're going to be talking about strategies in the real estate market and also how to get started with your real estate investing as well. So, before you buy a property, what are the main things you have to do? You first have to know your market. What do I mean by know your market? Well, know who is what kind of person or family or couple, etc., is going to rent your property, right? Is it going to be families who are looking for vacation homes for the week in a vacation rental kind of place? Is it going to be families coming for a long term stay? Or maybe it's university students who want to share a house together and live close to the campus, or have their own apartment and live close to the campus, something like that. Maybe it's a couple, a young working couple who does not have children yet. Anything like that, right? Someone getting, kind of a starter house, a starter apartment for the first few years. But basically, we want to know our market and know what kind of things they value and what they don't really value, but it's just going to cost extra money, but not actually add any value for your target market. So we'll talk more about that after, but that's the first thing. The second one is to calculate your startup costs. So, how much is it going to cost to get started, right? We're going to talk about all those different things. I think the main one people think of is the down payment, and that's certainly almost for sure going to be the bulk of the startup costs. But there are other startup costs as well that we'll get into later. The third one is understand the rules of property management. So, unless you're going to hire a property manager to do that for you, you're in charge of doing the advertising, you're in charge of taking care of a maintenance issue when something does happen, which inevitably it will at some point, that kind of stuff. So, understanding the rules of property management is key. And also understand the differences in choosing a new build or an older property. I know I have my preference, but there's definitely some pros and cons to each one. So let's dive in. Okay, so first one is to know your market. So first question you want to ask is there demand for rentals in the area that you're wanting to invest in? Because if there's not a lot of people looking for rentals in that area for whatever reason, then what's the point, right? What's the point? Or let's say you're looking to do short term rentals. Well, then let's choose a place to invest in that has a good market for short-term rentals where there's people who want that, right? A high tourist kind of area, or maybe cottage country, or somewhere where people do short-term rentals, right? Or let's say that you're looking to rent to students who go to a certain school. Is there a demand for housing for students in that region? Or do most students already have a place to live? Do most of them just live on the campus? Or do most of them live close enough that they can, just live with their parents, right? Because who's going to pay for a rental if they could just live with their parents and that's just as convenient? Or if they could live on the campus, right, for about the same amount. So keeping those things in mind, right? But maybe that's not the case, right? Maybe the school residence just doesn't have enough accommodation for everyone. And people are, there's lots of students every year who are looking to find off campus housing, right? Especially if there's a larger international student population, right? We know that those people aren't going to just have parents who live really close by. They're going to need a place to live. And if they can't get it on the campus, they are going to look outside the campus. So that's something to consider. The next one is who is your target demographic? We talked a little bit about this, but this is important to really consider as well, right? Is it a family who's going to stay there probably for 5 or 10 years in the end? Is it a couple? Is it students? Who are you targeting, right? Who is going to come live there, right? Or is it a business person who comes on, for a business trip there every few months if we're different business people, that kind of thing, right? Is it a short-term rental, long-term rental, all that kind of stuff? Okay, next one is how much are other places in the same area that are similar renting for, right? So for example, if you're renting a two-bedroom apartment in the middle of the city, how much are other two-bedroom apartments with similar square footages renting for in similar locations, right? That's going to help you to know how much could you realistically charge for that rental. So that's important to look into that. The next one, is there demand for long term rentals, medium term rentals, or short term rentals, right? So, for example, is it an area where it's very common for people to do Airbnb and just stay for a couple of weeks at a time or maybe a couple of months and then go back and do something else? Maybe medium term rentals. So, think of university students, right? They're going to need more than something short term. They're not just going to stay for a week and then leave or stay for 2 weeks and then leave, but they might stay for 1 year and then leave or 8 months and then leave or probably maximum 2, 3 years if it's, a bit longer term for them, or is it a long term? Is there more demand for long term rentals? So people who maybe they start with a 1 year lease, but then they continue on after that and continue to keep the place for, 5 years. And then eventually do move out and look for something else, but are looking to rent and have this be their home for a longer time, right? All that kind of stuff is important to keep in mind when determining what are we going to invest in. Okay. Now, the last one for this page is, are there any rules and regulations that prohibit or greatly restrict a certain type of rental? So, for example, if it's a big city like Toronto, they have specific rules about Airbnbs that other cities, or most other cities anyway, don't have, right? Or Toronto also has this new tax where if your home is vacant, then you have to pay some extra amount, as if there's not enough tax in Toronto already. But regardless, there's certain things like that are specific to the city of Toronto because it's such a big city, because there's so many people live in this city, that are not rules in other places, right? So just kind of learning, okay, is it just the provincial rules or the general rules that a certain state has or a certain country has, or are there extra rules in a certain city? And also, how likely is that city in the future to perhaps have rules added potentially, right? In a smaller city, smaller cities on average tend to have less rules than larger cities, but of course they're still constrained by the rules that the overall state has or the overall province has or things like that. But just being aware of any regulations that prohibit or greatly restrict certain types of rentals is important. Or if something like that's looking to be passed, definitely something to consider there. Also something I'll add here is, let's say it's a condo and the condo has rules, then that may be something to look into as well, right? There's some condo institutions that actually don't allow you to rent out or do certain types of rentals, which I personally don't like. I personally wouldn't buy, I wouldn't consider buying anything like that, because I may at some point, what if at some point I would like to do that? What if that's the best option for me, but I can't do that because of the rules? So I don't like that, but that is a thing. And some people are okay with buying real estate in those areas, or, even like the rule in some cases, because that also means everyone else has to follow it as well. So there are some benefits for some folks for things like that as well, even though I think they're nonsensical and it wouldn't make sense for me. Okay, let's talk about startup costs. So, first one is your down payment. Then we have land transfer tax, legal fees, and inspection fees. And also, if it's a short-term rental, consider also furniture or basic household items, or both, right? So, for example, let's say it's an Airbnb. Have you ever been to an Airbnb that does not have furniture? Or have you ever been to a hotel or any other short-term rental place that does not have furniture, right? So even though technically it's not required technically to have furniture in an Airbnb, nobody is going to book an unfurnished Airbnb, right? No one is going to bother with bringing their own furniture and taking it with them when they're just staying in a vacation rental for a week. Like, no one's going to do that. Even with medium term rentals, like with students, there are some student rentals where the students are responsible for furnishing the place themselves and bringing their own furniture and taking it with them after their time is up there, and they're going to move on to go and do something else after they're graduating or switching or doing something else. However, that said, it's also more convenient for students in a lot of cases to have a place that's furnished, right? If there's two different places that are relatively the same, but one is furnished and one is not furnished, the students are likely to choose the one that's furnished, right? Or even if it costs slightly more, maybe it's an extra $50 a month or an extra $25 a month for a place that's furnished, they might go for that, right? That might end up being worth it for them for that great convenience of having it furnished. So even though it's not technically mandatory for medium term rentals, it may be something you want to consider, right? That could be a selling feature, especially depending what type of a market you're in. That could be a big selling feature for people that is going to make it easier to rent out the space and attract more people. Okay. The next one is basic household items. So things like kitchenware, art, or home decor. And this is more so for short term rentals as opposed to medium or long term rentals, right? Because oftentimes people, when they're going to an Airbnb or a hotel, there's just some basic, there's some basic items already there. People don't usually bring their own plates and their own pots and pans and things like that. So that's something to consider as well, is you want to get a couple nice pieces of home decor, before you do pictures and things like that to advertise your short term rental. Do you want to have kitchenware included? Which, again, do you have to have kitchenware included? Is it mandatory? I'm guessing it's probably not mandatory. I'm guessing there's not a rule on Airbnb that says, or short term rentals in general, that says, oh, it must include this kitchenware. However, that said, that could be a useful thing for people. They probably would prefer a place that had kitchenware included, and it's something you've only got to buy once, right? So there you go. So those are the startup costs. Now the main one is the down payment for sure. That's going to be the most expensive. Go and find out for the area that you're in how much the down payment would be. The down payment wouldn't be typically like a certain dollar amount. It would be a percentage of the overall purchase price. Oftentimes 20%, but perhaps there's some places where it's more than that or less than that. But a common down payment, from my experience, is about 20% of the overall purchase price. Same with land transfer tax. Usually, for properties with a higher value, land transfer tax is more. Overall, there's also legal fees and inspection fees, which, depending on your area, to take a look at how much those will be. Those are usually not much in comparison to the last two. Usually, legal fees, I would say maybe about $1,000. Inspection fees, a few $100, maybe $500 max, something like that. So here's an example. Let's say we have a property that costs $500,000, which I know in some places, that is very expensive, and in other places that's very inexpensive. It'd be hard to even find a small condo for that in Toronto, for instance, but I'm aware that other places that's going to buy you quite a large house, maybe a 5 or 6 bedroom house with a big lot in some places. So what in terms of what $500,000 can get you really depends on location as to what that is going to look like. But let's say cost of the property is $500,000. Therefore, we need to have a down payment of $100,000. Let's say, for the sake of argument, land transfer tax is $12,000, lawyer fees are $1,000, and inspection fees are $300, for example. So make sure you have all those costs ready to go and you're aware of what the startup costs are before going forward with it. A lot of times people just look at the down payment, which is the bulk of it, but keep in mind that there are other expenses such as land transfer tax to be aware of. Okay, let's talk about the roles of property management. So, first one is advertising and doing showings. Now, in terms of how often or frequently you're going to be doing this, it's going to depend on the type of rental that you're going for, right? Let's say you're renting long term to a family and the family ends up staying 5 years, right? You may only have to, do advertising and showing every few years, right? Probably not that often if the target market are people who generally stay for at least 3 to 5 years and sometimes more. So that's definitely one. As for short-term rentals, people typically just, rely on reviews and pictures to do short-term rentals. However, for long-term rentals, people are not going to, sign a lease without actually going and seeing it in most cases, right? So there could be more frequent showings if it's like a student rental or somewhere where the tenants stay for a medium amount of time. So, usually anywhere from 8 months to 2, 3 years, maybe maximum for most students in terms of how long they're realistically going to decide to stay there. So that in terms of frequency of advertising and showings, it's going to greatly depend on the type that it is, right? Or if it's a short-term rental, well, it's always going to be up on the website, right? Even if you have someone right now, someone can book for a few weeks after, right? And someone can book for then a few weeks after that, right? Because it's a short-term rental place, so there's always people, looking for where they're going to stay next. So that's another one. The next one is screening tenants, which actually we'll talk about more in lecture four. Things like credit check, references, and a guarantor are important. I won't go into much detail about this here, but we will go over in the future what questions to ask and also what questions not to ask that are either inappropriate or invasive. It might surprise you because there's things you can ask that also might seem invasive but are okay, like doing a credit check or asking what someone's income is, or things like that. But then there are actually things that you really shouldn't ask, definitely. So we'll talk about that in the future. But that's a role. Maintenance and repairs. So whether you do, you know, whether you do the maintenance and repairs yourself, whether you hire out contractors, that sort of stuff, or hire professionals for various things, it depends. Also, just regular communication, check in once in a while, and then also cleaning between tenants. So, this could either be, a big regular thing that you do, or it could be something that barely ever happens, right? If it's a short term rental, then every week or two, or even sometimes before and after weekends, there's going to be either a cleanup crew that's hired, or maybe you go and you clean if it's close by or something like that. And because oftentimes on like Airbnb there's an option to have like an extra fee for cleaning to help you cover those expenses, or even entirely cover those expenses for you, depending how big the place is and things like that. So that's definitely an option to look into for sure. Or this might not happen very often at all, right? If you rent out the space to a family for 5 years, of course it's got to be clean before they go in there. But if they get a fresh start, they're the ones who are going to be cleaning it, right? When it comes down to it, they're going to be living there for a lot of years. So cleaning between tenants is a good thing and is an important thing. But in terms of how frequently that'll actually occur will greatly depend on the situation, but it is something to consider as well. Okay, so let's talk about a new build versus an older home. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to both. So the advantage of a new build include no upfront maintenance or renovations, right? Oftentimes, new builds have a certain warranty so that if anything is flaky, if anything isn't working, for a certain number of months, they come and fix it. And also, it's just less likely that there's going to be upfront maintenance or renovations because a new build is already going to be built nice and modern in styles that people like to this day. It's also less likely for like the air conditioner to break or the furnace to break than if it's brand new appliances, as opposed to a furnace that's already been there for 7 years and is probably going to break in the next few years, or be broken beyond the repair, where it's just not worth replacing it anymore. So that's a possibility. Or sorry, it's not worth repairing it anymore. It's best to replace it. There's also more demand for new builds, right? A lot more people like the new build, the new feel to it, and just having a nice a nice modern place, right? People do sometimes, in some cases, pay more if things are nice and newly renovated, right? Or it could be a reason for someone to choose one place over another. If one place, looks very nice and modern, and the other place looks very old, very dated, doesn't look as nice, right? That could be an incentive if they're both about the same price for someone to choose to Airbnb the place that looks really nice and new, right? So there's more demand for new builds. The average person would prefer a beautiful, newly renovated space than a very old and dated space, understandably so, right? Otherwise, why would builders build in that style if there wasn't demand for it? Also, oftentimes new builds are more innovative, right? So they might be more energy efficient. There's also not likely to be new builds that don't have newer types of things, right? Like, for example, almost no one is going to do a new build where there's no dishwasher, right? And so that there you go. That's automatically something that a lot of people would want in their rental that is included there in a new build. Whereas an older building might have a dishwasher, but some older builds wouldn't have that dishwasher, right? Or they might not have all of those, all those upgraded appliances, things like that. So there's definitely some advantages. And I think if you're getting a house, not out as a rental, not as an investment property, but just for you, right? Just for you yourself, a new build might absolutely appeal, right? If it's a rental, it's more complex though, because there are some advantages as well with older houses as well. So, for example, there is more choice in location with older houses, right? Because when you're getting a new build, it has to be in a place that where new construction is actually occurring. And if it's a very, very big city where pretty much all the space already has buildings, there's not really a lot of new builds that are coming because most places, are already built, or most of the land is already kind of taken. Then you don't have as much choice in location in that sense in some cases. Also, with older houses, there's no waiting, right? So with new builds, sometimes you might have to wait a whole year for the property to be ready. You might have to wait a few months for the property to be ready. Whereas generally, if someone's selling an older house, the closing date's going to be a few weeks, or at least, or maybe even a couple months, but not too long. There's going to be a lot less waiting. And one thing we're not going to have to wait for is we're not going to have to wait for the house to actually be ready for people to live there, right? So that's important. All right, well, that is going to be it for today. I will see everyone next day to continue our talk on this. I will see everyone then. Bye, everyone.